scripture reading today will be Genesis 3, 1 through 7. Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Indeed has God said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden. The woman said to the serpent, From the fruit of the trees of the garden you may eat. But from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die. The serpent said to the woman, You surely will not die, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it had a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her. And he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings.
Amen. Thank you, Isaac, for reading our scripture this morning. Again, welcome everybody. It's so good to see each of you here. Your smiling faces always encourages my faith, and always great to have everybody here. I want to, before I begin the lesson this morning, I want to introduce a couple of guests who are visiting with us this morning. Where's Rick Elledge? There he is. His wife, Stacy, all the way from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, is here this morning. Great to have you this morning. Good to finally meet you. After seeing your husband, he's been here, he's a member here actually, and placed membership here several months ago, and it's finally good to get to meet you. And then a couple of other people that are special guests that surprised me this morning when I walked in. I didn't even recognize them at first, as Charles and Carolyn Stevenson. Dr. Stevenson was the head of the Bible department for many years at Lubbock Christian University. And one of the very first people I met when I first got to the United States of America. So that was way back in January of '86. What's that, about 40 years or so ago? And he was the head of the Bible department back then. And so sure it's good to have you here this morning too, both you and your wife, Carolyn. I hope you have your Bibles with you this morning, because we're going to be looking into the text of God's Word. What a privilege it is to get into God's Word every Sunday, every time we do. For those of you who've been here, or maybe for those of you who haven't been here the last several weeks, we've been looking at the Ten Commandments, also known as the 10 Words to the Hebrews. That's to the Israelites, that's exactly how they would have referred to it, as the 10 Words. This morning we're dealing with commandment number 8. And it has to do with stealing. Thou shalt not steal, as the King James Version says. We know it well. And you know, it raises the question, have you ever had something stolen from you? Yeah, I think all of us have. But maybe a more important question is, have you ever stolen something from somebody else? I have to admit, guilty on, I can check both of those boxes, right? I know what it's like to be stolen from, and I know what it's like to steal from someone else as well. Something that from the day I was born I was told not to, and yet I can't say I haven't transgressed that very command myself. Humans seem to have a fascination with the idea of getting something for nothing. In fact, the reason we read this passage of Scripture this morning, Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, is because that records the first sin, which had to do with this very command. The first sin that humanity ever committed was that of theft. When Eve was told she wasn't supposed to take of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's exactly what she went ahead and did. Guess what? There you go. Sin number 1. The Hebrew verb to steal can have reference or have as its object humans as well as things, as well as all sorts of other things as well. It is also This concept of stealing also has to do with good context as well as bad context. So you can actually steal something good and it be a good thing. And if you're not, I had to check this one out. In 2 Kings chapter 11, starting with verse 1, we're not going to read this passage here, but it's basically the story of Athaliah, the wicked queen, Israelite queen. She went around killing the princes, her own sons, her own family, right? Because they would threaten her matriarchy, I guess, her royalty, right? She wanted to rule. She was a wicked queen. And yet, if you have a look at verse 2, Jehoshaphat, the daughter of King Jehoram and sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered. So she was about to murder these princes. He was in line to be murdered, and she stole him away from Athaliah's grasp so that she couldn't kill him. So there's an example of somebody who stole for good. And then the Bible is rife with all sorts of references about those who stole for bad. In Hosea chapter 4, verse 2, just a random text here, lists stealing along with all sorts of other offenses, abominations in God's sight. There's an interesting similarity between the 8th commandment, the one we're dealing with today, and the 10th commandment. Not to covet. The 10th commandment is not to covet your neighbor's wife, his house, his property, and all sorts of stuff, right? This 10th commandment doesn't only deal with subjective emotions, but it really has to do with, ultimately, acting on those emotions, which basically becomes theft again. Envying what your neighbor has, coveting what he has, his possessions, even his wife for that matter, and acting on those impulses, altogether wrong. Both the intent, the emotions that drive that, the desires for your neighbor's things, as well as acting on those emotions, all of that is forbidden by the 10 words here, both the 8th commandment as well as the 10th. So again, the 10th commandment is not simply against the emotions, but it includes the necessary corresponding action. The pursuit of the American dream means keeping up with the Joneses, right? We're all well familiar with that, and the impulse to do that. And the corresponding prayer then is, Lord, please keep my neighbors from buying something I can't afford, right? On the 10th commandment, Lewis Smedes notes that it has to do with putting your finger, and this is a quote, on the trigger of your will, to crouch like an animal poised to pounce. In other words, you're ready to take whatever your neighbor, as soon as he's not guarding his property, you're able to take that, you're going to act on that impulse to steal. And this 8th commandment then curbs that impulse. And again, with his, continuing with Lewis Smedes' comments here, keep your heart and your hands off of your neighbor's property. The 10th commandment then registers against the whole process from intent to action. Don't even think about it, let alone act on it. There's so many passages in the Old Testament where stealing is a feature. You remember prominently, probably, 1 Kings chapter 21, where Naboth's vineyard, and King Ahab ultimately stole Naboth's vineyard's property. David himself, and we mentioned this a minute ago, David himself stole Uriah's wife and committed adultery with her. There's so many other passages that we could reference here. I'm not going to read them all. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 8, Amos chapter 8, verses 4 through 6. Examples of people stealing what does not belong to them. A second question in our series here that we've been looking at this series, asking those 3 questions about what does this commandment actually ask or forbid us to do. A second thing would be, a second question then is, why does the commandment forbid whatever it is it forbids? And then thirdly, What are some practical implications? How do we live these things out in our lives today? And again, as I said, I do believe that the Ten Commandments are binding even today. You'll remember that we talked about this a few weeks ago, where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. And those injunctions that Jesus prescribed in the Sermon on the Mount were current even under the Old Covenant. Jesus wasn't giving his people a new commandment, so to speak. He was rather reinterpreting what God gave them from the word go. This is how God meant for his people to live throughout eternity. And I think these things are going to be binding even in eternity, for the most part. These kinds of principles, godly principles, these divine principles are binding. They were binding under the Old Covenant, and they're still binding even on God's people today. That's why I believe the Ten Commandments are still binding today. What happened in with the Sermon on the Mount? A lot of people think that God was giving us, Jesus was giving a whole new set of laws for Christians. But if you remember, Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount under the Old Covenant. Those were things that were binding back then. Jesus wasn't giving them a new command, but rather he was reinterpreting what the rabbis, the scribes, the Pharisees, all those people, the teachers of the law, they had misinterpreted the Old Covenant, and Jesus was correcting them, so to speak, and saying, this was God's intent from the beginning. All along, this is how God meant for his people to live. These were principles that were binding under the Old Covenant as well as under the New Covenant. And so then again, this eighth commandment certainly is binding under even the New Covenant. Why does the commandment then ask or forbid us from stealing? Ask us not to steal, or forbid us from stealing, should I say. First of all, because of covenant theology. To take from another is to deprive him of his gift from the Lord. In the Exodus, for instance, the people were possessionless slaves in Egypt. To steal from one's neighbor then was to impose upon him the very conditions from which he had been delivered. God had delivered them from that, and now then to steal from them would be to impose those very conditions again on those people. If you look at Leviticus chapter 19 and chapters 18 and 19, you see all sorts of commands and regulations that the people were to live by, that God had given his people. Most of them have to do with sexual immorality, okay, to abstain from sexual relations with even animals and all sorts of abominable things. But the reason God gave his people those commands, again, and you read this over and over in almost every verse in Leviticus 18 and chapter 19 as well. In almost every one of those verses, God says, I am the Lord your God. It's because of who God is that he gave his people these commands, right? Because of who he is. And you know what, people, again, as Hebrews chapter 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. These principles, again, apply across the board for all time. And you know what I think? When we get to heaven, I'm not sure that these principles are going to change any. Some of them probably won't apply. The ones about not committing adultery and so on, I don't think that's probably going to apply at all. But these principles are going to apply. We're going to live in eternity according to these, because this is who God is, and God doesn't change, right? I am the Lord your God. I think it's the importance of equality in the Israelite community is seen in practices such as the remission of debts on the Sabbath here, the year of Jubilee, field gleaning, and so on. That's another consideration when it comes to this command. Our relation to things and our relation to people ought to come into perspective here as well, into consideration. Our identity with things sometimes bears our identity more than others. The way we relate to the things that God has blessed us with, I think that has been a problem for many people, most all of us, through the years. And probably not ever so more so than than Americans who, we live in such an affluent society, an affluent world. I heard just this week again that the average American lives within the top 2% of the world's economy. We are so blessed, and we hear that so many times from people who present the Lord's Supper talks and so on. We are so blessed. I've been to situations overseas where little kids run around without any clothes on, or at best just a rag around a loincloth or whatever, stuff like that, because they have absolutely nothing, probably never experienced what it is to drive in a car, where people sleep on the sidewalks and so, whereas we live in our luxury homes with all sorts of air conditioning, and if it gets below 72, it's too cold, and if it gets above 72, it's too hot. We complain. We are so very blessed. I think no more so than for any other people, than for us, we ought to consider how we relate to things. And again, this whole idea of the pursuit of the American dream, we probably need to bring that into question. We're called, as God's people, to be caretakers of the things that God has given us. And I'm not going to put us on a guilt trip this morning for being wealthy. God has blessed us with these things that we have, the luxuries that we enjoy. God has given those things to us. Every good and perfect gift comes from God, comes from the Father above, right? The Father of lights, who doesn't change like shifting shadows and so on. Every good thing that we enjoy in life, we need to give thanks to God for those things, right? We don't have to feel guilty about having those things, but we have to have a godly attitude towards those things, right? We don't worship things. We need to worship God and thank Him for our possessions. I think the people often see, and we see this in society all the time, the accumulation of goods is the accumulation of power, and you see people whose lives are spent in the pursuit of the American dream, so to speak. Again, our relation to other persons also comes into focus here with this command. Theft always violates community by destroying trust. Community is violated too when people are deprived of things that they need in order to live humanely. 1 John chapter 3, you'll remember John the Apostle exhorts his audience to be willing to share with others and so on. If you see a brother in need, be sure to take care of that need, right? 1 John 3:16 and following. It's not simply about about what one does, but also about our thoughts and attitudes that have a moral impact on our community. Again, another aspect of this commandment that needs to be considered is Israel's relation to other nations. She was tempted to want what they had. Other nations had a monarchy, and so Israel said, no, we want a king ourselves as well. And you remember how that went for them. Some practical implications quickly as we wrap up our lesson. This command has often been abused by the wealthy to make sure that they retain their possessions and their power as a result. But it could actually be read as an indictment against those who amass wealth and accumulate goods by any and every means. Stealing, like murder and adultery, erodes the very ground and fabric of society, or our community, not the least of which being God's community. We probably need to rethink the notion again of property as an extension of ourselves, and I don't think we do this very well. To help us understand this commandment better, what if our family heirloom was stolen? I remember years ago, I grew up in my dad's shop. Since I was a little guy, I loved being out in the shop with him. In fact, my brother in the family was the sportsman, and I'd much rather be in the shop with my dad and so on. My dad used to do welding and just odd jobs and carpentry and that sort of stuff. So I loved working with wood. I loved doing some welding and so on. And Dad had a welder that was built for him. He had it specially built when he was young. It was in the family long before I came along. And I remember thinking for years that I'd like to inherit that welder. It was a big old yellow welder that I couldn't lift. It was heavy as the dickens, and just I, young and I could never lift it. I always remember that was the one thing that I wanted to inherit from my dad, all these years. I came to the U.S. and Dad was still over there, and still do whatever he did. And then several years after I was here, I heard that that welder had gotten stolen. Somebody had come into my dad's workshop and walked off with the welder. And I remember being absolutely disgusted, feeling totally violated, and not that I'd ever come to live in this country, not that that welder certainly, it had no value particularly. It had only sentimental value to me. It sure wouldn't have paid for me to have that welder shipped over here just so that I can, But I remember feeling very violated, that and being angry that somebody thought it's okay to walk into my dad's shop and walk off with something that I wanted to inherit from him. And now who knows where that welder is? It's probably not even a welder anymore. It's probably been dismantled and thrown in the trash. I don't know. But again, I think we need to rethink how our attitudes towards things in life, even those things that are irreplaceable, so to speak. To the poor, everything they have is important to life. And then for someone to deprive them of those very things, what a terrible shame that is, especially for one of God's people to act in that way. Goods shared in common, goods evidence our life together. Acts chapter 2 is what I'm thinking of, where the early church shared everything in common, and it was about people rather than about things. For that they shared everything. If somebody had need, the rest of the community would take care of that need and share what they had to fulfill that need. There are so many ways in which we can steal. Not just in taking things that don't belong to us, right? There's so many other ways that we can steal. We can steal time from our employer. We can steal information off of the net, right? I remember when the net when the internet was first developing years ago, probably 30 years ago or more, pirating songs, music off of the net was a big thing. I'm not sure that it's so much a big thing anymore because we have streaming services and whatever nowadays. But even music piracy, I guess, is still a thing today, right? There are so many ways in which we can steal. One of the things that I don't think we've done very well with is looking after the creation, God's creation that He put us in charge of. One of the things I think would be a neat something that we might do as a congregation here is to have some recycling bins out in the parking lot out there where the community can come by and recycle whatever they need to recycle, and we can be a recycling station for our community. I think that would be a responsible thing to do with regard to God's injunction for us as His people to look after the creation that He has put us in charge of. Lewis Swedes again says, "Is it always right to own and always wrong to steal? The moral right to property is usually more difficult to assess than the legal right." I think the moral right, again, is dependent on several factors, including how we obtained the goods we have, what sort of property we have, what sort of property we're talking about, and that could be a whole range of things. How much there is of it to go around, and how we care for those things as well. What kind of stewards we are with regard to those things. I think at the heart of this commandment number 8, thou shalt not steal, is that it addresses a lack of faith that God will provide. When I think I've got to have somebody else's stuff, whatever it is, and I help myself to that, which I'm not supposed to do, maybe that's because of my own thinking, my own lack of faith in God providing those things for me. or whatever it is I need. Maybe I don't even need my neighbor's stuff. And so what a violation, what an abomination it is in God's sight when I help myself to stuff that's not even mine, that I have no right to, that I, in God's sight, may not even need. And so when I do transgress this command, I think it's an absolute abomination in God's sight, and it shows a lack of faith on my part in God's provision for my life. And secondly, at the heart of this command is what I believe is simply discontent. Not being happy with the things that God has given us. You remember that passage over in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13. We know it well, right? I can do all things through him who gives me strength, right? That's a good verse, and you see it, it's popularly, you can see it on baseball caps, on t-shirts, mugs, you name it. It's one of those passages that any pagan can cite, right? I can do all things through Christ, or through him who gives me strength. But when you look at the context there, I think that the passage has very often been taken to mean I can do anything I want. As long as God's behind me, you know what, I can do whatever. I don't think that's what Paul was saying at all. When you look at the context there in Philippians chapter 4, let's start reading, picking up the context with verse 10. Paul says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you've been concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. In other words, Paul says, he's not saying that I can become the president of the United States, I can be the greatest football player there is, because that, in my case, just ain't happening, right? We can't do everything through God who gives me strength. But what Paul says he can do is I can be content whatever circumstances I find myself in. Okay? So whether I'm well-fed or hungry, I can be content because God gives me the strength to be content. And I think, again, with regard to this 8th commandment here, a discontent with my circumstances is what this command addresses. And acting on that discontent, leading me to steal from others to try and satisfy my needs, my perceived needs. That's what this command addresses. Paul says, you know, when you have Paul's attitude here, I can be content whatever circumstances. If I'm desperately in need, if I'm going hungry, I can be content. I'm okay with that, he says, because God allows me to be okay. I'll be okay. Do you see Paul stealing from others because he's hungry? Or because he thinks he needs somebody else's goods, whatever they are? When you have this attitude of contentment, you don't need to steal from others. If you have a faith that God will provide, you don't need to steal from others, right? I think we've often gotten it back to front or gotten the cart before the horse. And you see this attitude in so many people in the world. Where people are discontent with their circumstances and they're content with who they are. I'm happy with who, I don't need to improve in any respect. I'm just happy with who I am. But I'm discontent with my circumstances. I don't have enough of this. I don't have a big enough income. I don't have a fancy enough car or a house, whatever. I'm discontent with what I have, with my circumstances. I'm discontent, but I'm happy with who I am. It should be the other way around, shouldn't it? We should be content with our circumstances and discontent with who we are. And I say that not in a negative way per se, but I should have the attitude that I want to be a better Christian tomorrow than I am today. I'm okay with my circumstances. I'm okay with my salary. I'm okay with the car that I drive, and maybe a clunker, whatever. I'm okay with that. That's okay. God gives me the ability to be happy with those things, to be content with those things, with my circumstances, whatever circumstances I find myself in. be content, whether well-fed or poor, whether hungry, you name it, I can be content with all those things. But I'm discontent with who I am because I want to be a better Gary tomorrow. I want to be a better person, a better Christian, a better soldier of the Lord tomorrow than I was today. I think that's a far more biblical attitude to have rather than to be discontent with our circumstances and content with who I am. There's all sorts of improvement that I need to make as a person of Jesus as opposed to the circumstances that I have. My circumstances are going to be okay. They're fine. Let me say this. With regard to our circumstances, again, I don't think it's wrong to be rich. Okay? I'd like at 1 Timothy really quickly, and we'll wrap up our lesson for this morning. 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Let's try chapter 6 instead. 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting with verse 17. Listen carefully to this. Paul says, "Command those who are rich in this world, in this present world, not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasures for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life." It may be all right to own things, but that doesn't necessarily justify a life of greed and grabbing everything we can get. The real problem with the thief is his dissatisfaction with what God has given him. 3 ways to guard against the temptation to steal, and really 4 here that I've listed. Number 1, to cultivate a thankful spirit. Count your blessings, in other words. Be thankful for what you have, what God has given us. Number 2, enjoy those blessings according to the very passage that we've just read, 1 Timothy 6, 17 through 19. Number 3, share whatever you can. Be willing to help others. And I think, when I look at our congregation, I think we've done an excellent job of doing just that. I think we're a very warm, welcoming congregation. By the way, guys, remember to show a little bit of love to our visitors, to make them feel welcome. If you don't know who they are, please go and introduce yourself to them and make them feel welcome. We want them back, and the only way they're coming back is if they feel welcomed, okay? So be sure to do that. And then number 4, trust God to provide. And again, I think that strikes at the very heart of commandment number 8, not to steal. Trust God to give you what you need. We can have a look at Matthew 6:19 and other passages as well, where Jesus said to lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, not treasures here on earth. May God bless us all as we strive to do exactly that this week. The lesson is yours. If you need to respond to the gospel invitation, we stand ready to assist you as you become a child of God. If you need the prayers of a congregation or you know of somebody who we need to be praying for, please let us know.